effectively with others as a community and individually. Throughout her life, she has experienced significant loss and trauma, leaving her with the choice to let it consume her or let it shape her. Choosing the latter, she believes that pain well lived through becomes the most beautiful masterpiece. Her life experience has enabled her with the ability to relate, understand, and genuinely walk with others in their pain. Please help me in welcoming Nicole.
Thank you. All right, the only black guy in the room is my videographer. It's okay, Stephen and I go way back, I can do that. I like to bring culture with me, which is why I bring him. Do you want me to keep going, Stephen? Okay. Yes, I am aware that I am not wearing shoes. When I speak from my heart. I speak from a very vulnerable place, and I have found that doing it barefoot really just allows me to go to that place. I have to say that it's an absolute honor for me to be sharing today with Abe. Abe is one of the first people that believed in me and in my potential and in my ability to be someone. So it's an absolute honor for me to be sharing this day with Abe. So when I think of when I was little, I remember thinking that living with another family seemed easier. It seemed to me that other families laughed more, had more fun, fought less. It just seemed to me that living with another family would be easier. From my experience, from my family, there were so many rules. And these rules weren't necessarily implemented because they were proven to be good or to actually benefit our lives. They were implemented because that is what was required of us culturally and religiously. Yet feeling this, at the end of the day, when I would close my eyes, I couldn't imagine feeling that safe, that secure anywhere else other than under the same roof as my 8 siblings with my parents. Oh, there we go. I have since then learned that my observation of other families was likely a bit skewed, considering that what is seen is generally skewed by expectations of society. But what I felt about my own family, the good and the hard, that was real though. Today, I want to share with you some cultural perspectives in regards to education, equality, work and finance, and healing and loss. As Abe mentioned before, I also want to just make sure that we are aware. We do talk about culture as a collective, and today specifically about the Low German Mennonites. And there are absolutely norms and rules that are followed as a whole. But from my perspective and opinion, each individual family has a unique cultural dynamic. So I have grown to learn that 2 different people coming from 2 different families, having grown up in the exact same culture, in the exact same church, can live with 2 very different realities. In that sense, I am hesitant to look at culture as a collective, because it can diminish the individuality of each person that we encounter on a daily basis. When I look at people that impacted my life outside of my culture, they were the ones that saw me. They likely had an understanding of cultural norms, but they did not treat me according to their understanding of a cultural norm. They used that to really be able to walk with me as an individual. And what a journey it's been. That was grade 4. Here, I definitely knew that I looked different, but I didn't really feel that difference yet. Yeah. Further away? Is that better? Okay, perfect. And let's be honest, it's not that many years ago, but yes, back then, it was abnormal for you to have an LGM kid in your class. I went to public school until I was in grade 6, and I only ever remember having another LGM kid in my class once or twice. And they were kids that deemed to be LGM, but they had been fortunate enough to have been born into a family that did not adhere to strict LGM clothing. I, on the other hand, was fortunate enough to have been born into a family that was too cheap for private school and too religious to allow me to wear anything to even slightly blend in, so I stuck out like a sore thumb through it all. This was grade 6. Here, is it like, where's Waldo? I showed that to my daughter the other day and she said, Mom, not only did you look different, but you didn't even know how to smile. The innocence of a child, right? So here, not only did I feel or did I look different, but I absolutely felt different. It started gradually. I would be pulled out of sex ed classes, and when sports was being played, I was pulled out. When shows were being watched, I was pulled out. And every time a child is pulled out of a group, it begins to shape a I am different mentality. And although I see being different as a positive now, I definitely didn't growing up. And I imagine it doesn't take most of us very long to think of a time where we felt different. And in processing that, we may be surprised how that has shaped how we view ourselves today, or at least how we think of ourselves today. Being different feels so uncomfortable that when given the opportunity, most of us will choose to leave a situation that makes us feel different. And I was given that opportunity in grade 6. At some point in grade 6. I had officially reached the age where canola, potatoes, and onions would hire me, and that kept me busy for most of the year. Not being of legal age to drop out of school was easily taken care of by registering me for a homeschooling program that I would only ever register for. The thing is, you don't require an education to know how to cheat the system. So age 12 to 18 accounted for countless of hours of weeding and grading and daydreaming of all that I wished I would become one day. My dreams seemed unrealistic to me, not because I didn't believe I was capable, but because religion and culture had another plan for me. Finishing school and doing something profound with my life was meant for someone that was born into another family, or someone with different genitalia. Although possibilities were somewhat limited for both boys and girls, patriarchy was very real in my family. My sisters and I worked equal to what my brothers did, and we would go to the same events and social functions as my brothers did, or the Sunday parties. The fact that, and only my brothers would get an allowance. The fact that we may need money for food or entertainment wasn't even considered. We were females after all, and there should be guys around to take care of us. Fortunately enough, my brothers were kind enough that on those Sundays where a guy hadn't picked us yet come supper time, that they would pay for us. Gender-defined roles were also very evident in our day-to-day life. All 11 of us would be sitting around a table, and if one of the guys needed salt, who should get up to get it was never questioned. And for the most part, operations ran fairly smoothly because of this, and it was never fussed about. And I recognize that defined roles were initially adapted in a setting where they worked well. The problem is that the challenge is in how they have carried over into a time where women have also entered the workforce. And although more evident in the LGM culture, I think most of us here today can relate to that topic. Although in North America, we have now started requesting that men too get up to get the salt. In a recent study done by the University of Lethbridge, it showed that men still get paid an average of $10,000 a year more than women for getting up to get the same salt women are getting. That's a bit of a side note, but it is humbling for us to know that we are all a work in progress. That we are all on this journey of life together, just on different chapters. Now, I get that it's the afternoon and a bit of a challenge to stay awake, but I have purposely lived a bit on the edge to make this entertaining, or at least worth your while. So for those of you that stay with me, I promise to make it worth your while. So you go from that to this. There is absolutely hope for all of us. To some, hope is presented and choices are made and encouraged fairly effortlessly. To others, we have to dig a bit deeper and create our own path. On the last day of harvest in 2003, I decided that I was going to start creating my own path regardless of what it was going to take, in hope that I'd be able to fulfill at least one or two of my dreams. I enrolled in the upgrading program at the Lethbridge College, completely against my parents' will. And then I moved out on my own as a Low German woman. And I know I see this happening more and more now with our young girls and guys as well, but back then, just a few short years ago, my parents did not know a single other family going through what they were going through. Girls my age were getting married and starting a family. To them, they had failed through and through in raising me. It seems a bit humorous to me now in raising my own daughter that if she were to say to me that she's going to go to college and live out her passion and her dreams, yet feeling like a failure as a parent. But the thing is, life has unfolded for me in a way that I've come to see and learn that we are all afraid of the unknown. And that's exactly what it was for my parents, the unknown. It wasn't about them not wanting me to go to school or not wanting me to follow my dreams. It was about what they knew, and what they knew was survival. My parents came to Canada in 1984 with 8 children under the age of 11, having lived on nothing but beans and rice for a few years before that. The economy in Mexico had been so bad that my parents had only been able to keep the bare minimum on the table, with my dad hauling milk to the cheese factory until his truck was taken away from him against debt that he owed. And that was their last straw. They officially had no way to provide for their ever-growing family. Until friends of theirs came to get them and bring them back to Canada. They came to Canada to survive, not to live out their passions and their dreams. They came to eat meat, fruits, and vegetables. Actually, that's a lie. Vegetables, my dad would say, were for rabbits. They came to eat meat and potatoes and keep a roof over their head. I've come to realize that they came to Canada not really having any idea what life was going to be like here. And for the most part, I don't think they ever really got over living in survival. They went from dirt floors to carpet, from dirt paths to highways, from hardly paying with cash to being able to swipe a card, from never having heard of credit to paying interest, from not being able to buy unless you had the change, to being able to buy a house, a car, furniture, as long as you had a monthly check coming in, even if that said check does not ever have the potential to pay for all of that. And with that, before you know it, you're the 9-year-old at the table at the end of every month, moving money from one credit card to the next, trying to make bill payments. The lack of financial education, not necessarily just amongst Low German Mennonites and other immigrants, but across the board, is staggering. My parents gave up worrying for how they would pay for rice and beans to worrying about how they would ever pay off their debt, which they never did. When I look back at my parents' financial reality, it's hard for me to swallow. My dad worked hard on his own for the first 5 years or so of them coming here. But as I mentioned earlier, they adhere to a cultural practice that you start working as soon as you're able. And then your funds are used as a collective to help support the family. Essentially, the parents do their part in raising you, and once you are able, you support the family as a whole. And here's what gets me. There was a point in my mom and dad's life where all 9 of us kids were working full-time. And it all went into one account collectively. Now, I get that raising 9 kids would be crazy expensive, but you don't even need to be good at math to know that 9 times $2,000 is almost $20,000 a month. And I find it hard to believe that that's what it costs to raise us, especially considering we were all homegrown. Where it all went is beyond me. This was our sad reality and still is the case for so many families today. North America offers false financial possibilities with no education. And this is hurting families, and it's being passed on from generation to generation. That's what my parents had in their bank account on March 1st, 2009, with absolutely no savings and 7 credit cards maxed out. Needless to say, as I reflect on life, I could easily go down a path of my parents were given an opportunity to make something of their life, and they didn't. Instead, they chose religion and survival, and a whole lot of pain for me to work through. But that's only when I look at life from my perspective and a very limiting lens. Life is so much bigger and the details are far more intricate than you and I tend to see. I wonder if we ever really, really get it. And I don't think we do. Often not until it's too late. Life has had a way of knocking me down, and getting up has led me down a beautiful path of healing. Not just my own healing, but generations of pain and hurt. My mom used to always say that she was certain that there was a mix-up in the hospital, that I was not actually their daughter, that she was sure that they gave them someone else's kid and that their daughter actually went home with someone else. It's possible, other than the fact before the world of Invisalign, there's no denying there. But unlike my other siblings, I was always questioning the rules. Internally for the most part, but every once in a while they would slip out. I felt like I was always going against the grain, always disappointing my parents in their cultural expectations of me. But even though it felt hard, I had this hope and determination. You know, that endless supply of youthful hope and determination that we think will never run out. And then all of a sudden we find ourselves in our 30s reading every damn motivational book, trying to get just an ounce out of there and back into ourselves to no avail. But the thing is, extensive manuals on how to live our lives have only been a thing in the last few years. Before that, it was figure it out as you go. And even though now we have access to extensive manuals, essentially each one of us is still just figuring it out as we go. So when we were dealt our first card of death, when my oldest sister died in a car accident, we did the best we knew how. How death is to be a natural part of life still baffles me. How we as humans are supposed to process that and carry on. Yet somehow we do it. And some of us even keep on living after experiencing the loss of someone we love. Until April 6, 2005, death to me was something that only happened to other people, which is likely still the case for some of you here today. The unfortunate reality is all of us will have to experience it at some point or another. Now, I vaguely remember sirens making their way across town around 11 that morning. But at that point in my life, sirens meant that someone was getting help, not that someone had just died. I was supposed to take my cousin to my sister's house, but I was running late that morning, so I called my sister and I asked if she would come and get her, to which she was happy to do. And then she went on and on and on about her day, and I was annoyed because I was running late and I didn't have time to listen to her. She finally hung up and I ran out the door. Not long after that, I got a call from an acquaintance, and he said, "There's been an accident along this route, and it looks like your sister's van. Do you know if she was in that direction?" Only because I had asked her to. I couldn't find the scene on the way that I always took, so I went to the hospital, and the ambulance and I pulled up at the same time. Not really sure what to do or what to expect, I ran up to the back of the ambulance, and the paramedics were just getting out, and I said, "I think I may know the mom and the two boys that are in there." And they said, "We only have 2 little boys in here. Would you be able to identify them?" Then I said, "But where is my sister?" They first looked at each other, and then they looked at me, hoping the other person would say it. The one paramedic finally said, "I'm really sorry, but she's not here. She didn't make it." "What do you mean she didn't make it? As in she missed this ride and was on the next one?" I wanted to remind him that he was talking to me and that death was not a part of our family. That is not something that we had signed up for. But that was now our reality. I don't really remember much of the time in between calls and arrival, just flashes of utter heartbreak. The look on my mom's face telling her that her daughter was gone, my dad choosing blame to cover his pain, and then my brother-in-law. How do you tell someone that their love is gone forever, never to be on this earth again? Expressions often say more than words, and he was able to pick up what all of us together could not put down. The "where is she" was met with head shakes, which broke him into a million pieces. The body has a way of breaking with the heart. Now the kids. There was 4 under the age of 8. The 2 that had been with her were being transported via ambulance to the Lethbridge Hospital alone as we gutted the reality of death. But the oldest 2, however, had gone to school that morning with no care in the world, believing that life was fine and it would still be when they came home from school that day. I guess even as adults we live in that reality, never really knowing what the day is going to bring. And I don't know that we fully grasp the mind of little ones, how much it is that they can comprehend, especially when it comes to something as unfathomable as death. But either way, they needed to be told. The school hallway was so cold. I got down on my knees to be at their level, and I finally was able to utter something along the lines of, "Something really hard has happened, and life is going to be hard for a while, but in the end, I believe we're all going to be okay." Really trying to convince myself more than them. The reality of those words only started sinking in the days to come. Yet somehow, resilience shines through, and the rest of us keep breathing, even the children. Now, when it comes to death and the process that follows, there are absolutely cultural norms and practices that are followed. But the intricate details on how death is processed could very much absolutely differs from family to family. Considering the fact that my parents did not process life, they were not about to process death. There was no memorial or celebration of life. It was funeral and very much open casket, which it usually is, regardless of what the body looks like. Grieving was not a thing in my family. There was this belief that if you brought up the person too much that had passed away, that you'd be disturbing their rest. So we did what I imagine so many others have done and still do. We kept our mouths shut. We were doing her dishes, making her food, bathing her children. The pain was never ending, and we did it all in silence, in gosh, awful silence. And we carried that with us until the next shoe dropped. It was February 28th, 2009. I called my mom to tell her that I loved her, and she said, "Me too." This was big because growing up, I had never heard the words, "I love you." And you don't really know what it is you're missing until it's pointed out or brought to your attention. We arrived in Israel late that evening, and because I had slept the entire flight, sleep eluded me. So I was lying in bed in a foreign place and wondering what the days ahead would hold, dreaming of all the possibilities. But around 3 a.m., I had this gut feeling that something wasn't right. I couldn't shake it, so I finally got up and I turned on my phone to check the time. And to my surprise, I had a ton of messages. I didn't even realize I had phone service. The first message said, "Eva, call us as soon as possible." The second message said, "Eva, call us, something really bad has happened." I listened to message after message until I was completely numb. I finally got on the phone and was met with the words, "There has been another car accident in your family, and your mom is gone." And I didn't hear anything after that. The words slurred and the world became extremely still. It's really hard for me to put into words what I felt in that moment. And I'm not sure the English language actually has words to describe what that felt like. After sitting there for a while, trying to catch my breath, this numbing sensation deepened, as if an emotional breaker flipped. The next 12 hours were an absolute blur. I remember things here and there, like knocking on Abe's door, the look on his face. By the time I got on the plane that day, my new reality was beginning to sink in. My mom, 2 nephews and a niece had died at the scene, and my dad and my brother were in critical condition in the ICU in Calgary with very little chance of surviving. And I remember sitting down in my seat on the plane that day, and that one time actually hoping the plane would fall out of the sky, because what awaited me seemed insurmountable. Now, my first experience with death didn't really leave me with much bitterness, neither at God or the culture, but this time around was different. Bitterness started creeping in fairly early on. It started at the hospital. So many people that I had never heard of were coming to the ICU to see my dad and brother on life support. It got to be so much that the nurses actually had to get a password, and only those that knew the password were allowed to come in. Little did they know what culture they were dealing with, and that word of mouth spreads faster than they can even fathom. I was struggling to understand the intention of coming to see someone who is non-responsive. and then ask the family a ton of questions. This seemed hurtful at the time, not helpful. I felt like our pain was being used to satisfy curiosity. And that was just at the hospital. We also had 2 different funerals to plan. And with funerals come viewings. This is where the caskets are placed in front of the funeral home, and you as a family sit in front of the funeral home with the open caskets. Because of the magnitude of this tragedy, so many people came to the viewing. As a family, we sat there in the front for 3 hours with a lineup out the door and a never-ending stream of people coming through. Now you may think, how amazing to get support like that. But the thing is, out of those hundreds of people that came to that viewing, maybe a handful of them stopped to connect with us as a family. In that moment, nothing about that left me feeling cared for or held. I left feeling exhausted, alone, and frustrated. I am a firm believer that if there ever is a time in a person's life to be selfish, it is in loss. Neglecting our heart and pain to appease those around us in the most vulnerable state of a human's heart has the ability to leave lasting damage and immense bitterness. Life has since then taken me to a place where I'm able to see that, in their own way, perhaps they were showing up. Culturally speaking, they did what they knew how. I am able to separate the intention from reception. Our reception of something is often misguided by the intent in which it was given. Realizing that and processing my pain accordingly has allowed me to say, so much of that did not serve me or help me, but the intent in which it was given was good. There has been so much freedom and healing for me to acknowledge my pain, but also recognize the intent. These 2 tragedies gave me immense depth to loss and what that does to a human heart. But I had not yet walked through a diagnosis. So clearly that was next on my radar. Somewhere between life and death, I had gotten married to a non-LGM, which was also a feat on its own. And I had given birth to the most amazing human on this planet. Oh yeah. If you drive between Bow Island and 7 Persons on Highway 3, you will find that. Because life had been relatively, message. It's okay, it's all good. Because life had been relatively stable and with minimal trauma, as a young couple, we decided to accept a 10-year term with Transworld Radio in Bolivia. 7 deaths, a marriage, and childbirth weren't life-altering enough, so a move across the country seemed appropriate. We first moved to Texas to study Spanish for our term in Bolivia. And while we were there, during one of Gary's tutoring sessions, I was met with a brutal knock on the door. The guy kept telling me that Gary was seizing. And I had never seen a seizure in my life before, so I had no idea what he's talking about, but my natural instincts shot me across the campus barefoot to be met by a sight that I will never forget. If you've never seen a seizure happen, it literally looks like the person is dying. And much of what happened next is, again, a bit of a blur, which these blurs are an absolute blessing. I do, however, vividly recall what our ER doctor looked like. She walked into the room with the MRI results wearing a skin-tight mini dress with stilettos. How you work as an ER doc like in that is beyond me, but we were in Texas, so anything is possible. She stood in front of the bed and she said, "Well, you have a large mass in your brain. We don't know what it is at this point. We will get you in to see a neurosurgeon tomorrow, and then we'll go from there. Do you have any questions?" No? Good. We'll see you tomorrow then. She gave us maybe 5 seconds. We hadn't even begun to chew what she had just fed us, much less come up with any questions. And I don't remember exactly what the first words were out of my mouth, but I know it was something about Bolivia. Something along the line of, "Will we still be able to go to Bolivia?" And I know that makes me seem like an insanely careless individual, and lots of other people use a variety of different words to describe me in that moment. But I am very task-oriented, and a brain mass was not a part of our tasks 6 weeks before we were scheduled to leave for Bolivia, after having worked towards that goal for 2 years. Much to your surprise, I'm sure, we did not go to Bolivia in 6 weeks. We actually came back to Canada for treatment and surgery. And I'd say that was the tipping point for me. Physically and mentally, I started feeling different. Fortunate for Gary, since he was the brain cancer patient, he got all the steroids, and apparently caregiver didn't qualify me for any. And the steroids gave him enough energy that 2 weeks post-brain surgery, he was painting a fence. I, on the other hand, was knee-deep in pain and grief with a sick husband and a 2-year-old. Even though I was beginning to feel different in that moment, I was not aware of it. I kept pushing through as if I was totally fine. Because if I was taught anything growing up, it was that you don't give up. And not giving up meant suppressing everything you feel. And you put a smile on your face for the world to see and for the world to believe. I constantly heard, "How you're handling all of this is amazing, Eva. You're the strongest person I know. Just keep doing what you're doing." And what I was doing was dying. Surprise. Amidst all of that, we did end up still going to Bolivia. After treatment and surgery, his medical team suggested that since our entire life had been consumed by the plan to go to Bolivia, that if we didn't do that, it would mean that we were giving into cancer, and Gary needed something to live for. So we packed up and we went to serve and to save other people, actually believing that we were going to be okay. And we were not. Gary's tumor had been in the left frontal lobe, which is often said to be the control panel for one's emotions, reasonings, and behavior. I am sensitive to this part of my story because it so intricately involves his story as well. I've never felt the need to go into details of what day-to-day life was like during that time. Usually, the ones that are supposed to get it do. After almost 2 years of being in Bolivia, I no longer knew myself. Whether I was being complimented or yelled at, it did nothing to me. I had grown completely numb to everything in this world. I didn't know much at that point, but I knew we needed to get back. When we finally got back, I, for the first time, started speaking about my truth. Unfortunately, it wasn't well received by many. Fortunately, all I needed was 1 or 2 to see me and a handful of professionals to see me. I had come to a place in my life where serving others and neglecting myself was literally killing me. And I had to choose to die in the face of my reputation of having it all together and being so strong, or shed light on my truth and disappoint hundreds of people along the way. It came to me very clearly, speaking to the wrong person about my reality. She said, "Eva, you have to stay strong and you have to stay in this marriage. Because if you don't, think of Elena and everyone that believes in you. What will it do to you, to her, and to your reputation?" Even in my broken state, it was so clear to me in that moment that I needed to start living my truth, regardless of what that was going to look like. Not just for me, but actually for my daughter. That not my friend anymore helped me to see that what I was doing in the name of keeping it all together for everyone around me was absolute BS. And it was so detrimental for my daughter to see. She lit a fire within me to live authentic, raw, and vulnerable in all aspects. Because if there was anything I wanted to prevent my daughter from having to live through, it was living the life that I was living. Alone, secluded, and drowning in my pain. All in the name of societal and religious expectations. And that was a turning point for me. I started the long, never-ending journey of healing with a psychologist, a spiritual mentor, and a couple of really close friends. I'd love to tell you that I'm healed now and that life is just peachy, but that's not the case. I'm doing pretty good for the most part, but I definitely still have days and sometimes weeks where my heart feels pretty bruised. But I approach those days and those weeks very differently from what I used to do. I sit in my pain, I feel it, I process it, and then I move past it. Very different from before, where I denied it, never processed it, and never felt it. I was taught how to take care of others, but never how to take care of myself. And I think many of you here today can relate to that, regardless of your cultural background. And I know there is this whole new movement of self-love and self-care out there, and to be honest, some of that is bogus. But I'm not talking about selfishly only focusing on ourselves in all stages of life. I'm talking about taking care of ourselves enough so that we can actually show up and do pain with others. If we're not taking care of ourselves, what we have left to give to others is not really worth giving. We can only extend to others what we're willing to extend to ourselves. And I wonder for how many of us to hear today if what we extend to ourselves would be really worth giving to others. I can tell you that if I had not spent the last 4 years in healing, I'd be bitter, depressed, and not doing anything with my life. I'd be bitter against my parents and how I was raised, against the culture and what it stands for. But instead, healing has allowed me to look at life from their perspective. Recognize the hard and process it for what it was, and celebrate the good for what it was. Healing and awareness is slowly bringing back that hope and determination, leading me to a place where I now have the ability to use my story to impact the lives of others on a daily basis. I am so passionate about how we walk through our pain and how we show up for others in theirs. It is complex, scary, but it can also be so beautiful. My psychologist was bang on when she said, Eva, a lot of the hurt that you're feeling is not actually from your loss itself. It is from what people said to you in your loss. A common statement that I heard over and over was, just stay strong. Just stay strong. And it did absolutely nothing for me. In those moments, what we really need is just a momentary place to land where we don't need to stay strong, where we can lean on others to stay strong for us while we heal our heart, mind, body, and soul. When we go through pain and loss, there is nothing anybody can say that is going to change our circumstances. And regardless of cultural background, I guarantee you there is one thing that works: showing up and listening. Sitting with someone in their pain is a powerful position for a person to be in. You have the ability to profoundly shape what that individual feels they should or should not be feeling. It is a very vulnerable, raw time in their life. When we show up with an agenda that they need to stay strong or whatever it is, it denies them their truth and the ability to even recognize what it is that they're actually feeling. My biggest belief through grief and loss is that there is no right or wrong, but that it is an absolute sacred journey for each one individually. But not being able to define it or put it in a box that works for all is scary to us, because we want to heal and then move on. We want to fix it and then move on. And as much as I wish that were the case, unfortunately, healing is not something that you can do for others, but you can do it with others. I believe that how we go through our tragedies and our pain and our trauma is directly related to our health individually, and then it spills over into the health of our families, and then the health of our city, our town, and then the health of our province and the health of our country and humanity as a whole. If you ever meet a broken individual, I can almost guarantee you that if you trace it back, it stems from a pain or a trauma that was not well lived through. If we continue to live out our pain in silence and allow others to do the same, we are not only affecting ourselves, but we're affecting the state of humanity, with negative rippling effects for generations to come. When I look back on my life and how I was raised and how culture influenced me, and I look at where things are now, as a community and as a culture, we've come a long way. We're at the cusp of realizing the importance of education. More and more kids are staying in school at least through grade 12, and some even going on to college and university. I see a slight shift in how women are treated, and I see young dads stepping up to parent along with their wives. I see parents creating a space for their children to step out in their unique talents and abilities. And I see a variety of opportunities being explored. I see healing. Unfortunately, I also see that we still have a long way to go. So much of what goes on behind closed doors in the name of culture and religion is too much for us to comprehend or fathom. So this shift, this unfolding change is crucial for impact and influence. Regardless of what position you find yourself in today, I see every opportunity, I see every encounter as an opportunity for us to be a part of that change in a positive way. I believe that we can build into the cultural positives to bring out healing and beautiful communities that stand together. And it all starts with self-reflection. Self-reflection leads to awareness. Awareness followed by action leads to change. Intentional, positive change is the start of beautiful healing.
Thank you, Eva, for sharing that with us. Do we have any questions from the audience? I would just add that as service providers, you have no idea just the impact that you can have on families, even with not understanding the culture 100%. If you are able to build relationship and trust with those that come to you for help, if any of them are experiencing any of these things that Eva has just talked about, or even just struggling with their identity, I can say for my family, we definitely struggled with our identity. We didn't know, we didn't fit into the LGM world, especially when we went to Durango, and it was very, very traditional. And so coming back to Canada, we didn't fit into the Canadian culture either. So for myself and many of my siblings, it took us a lot of years to decide where we had one foot in both worlds. So to decide where we wanted to be, and assimilation into the Canadian culture is what inevitably took place, which I think for all of us in my family has been a positive thing, but it was definitely not an easy journey. So obviously I haven't experienced nearly what you have, but I can say that every one of you, if you're working with our LGM families, the impact you can have is massive. I can maybe not remember names, but I will always remember faces and service providers that came alongside us over the years in Ontario, and just helped us to figure out who we are, helped us to navigate our feelings. Because in the Mennonite culture, feelings is, there's not really even a way to say how do you feel when it comes to emotions.
Yeah, I can definitely comment on that as well. So some of the things, so to ask a Low German Mennonite, especially the woman and absolutely the men as well, to say, to talk about trauma or healing or traumatic events in their lives, that's sort of going to be a dead end, especially for new immigrants for sure. But a question that I often feel is not just good for the Low German Mennonites, but for all of us, is if you look someone in the eye and you ask them, are you tired? And you'll be surprised what that does, right? Because that is something that they can relate to. Are you eating well? So if we bring that into just day-to-day questions that they can relate to, because all of that is tied to that trauma and to that pain, right? And so there are words that we can use that they will be able to understand, and will be surprised by just how that will absolutely just open a floodgate. And in regards to the impact that you have as service providers, as I mentioned, Abe was honestly one of the first people that started believing in me. There is so much of my story that I did not share in there, but I worked in the MCC office here in Taber for 2 years. I was on the MCC Alberta board, and I also worked at the Taber thrift shop here for a while. And it was because Abe believed in me way before I believed in myself. And there wasn't just Abe, but I distinctly remember teachers when I was upgrading, and even in elementary school, that even though I felt so different, but they wouldn't treat me different, and they just the way they looked at me and the way they saw me, that's all it took is for me to plant that seed of belief and just this ability to start actually believing in myself, and for me to start dreaming, right? I can share a story. I was on the MCC Alberta board just as a member, and the board chair was not there that day, and Abe says, oh, that's fine. I think I was the treasurer or the secretary, and Abe says, that's fine, Eva can chair the board. And I said, are you kidding me? I'm a 19-year-old Mennonite girl, I have no idea. And he's like, yeah, just figure it out, you'll do great. And those are the kind of things that I will remember forever, and that is exactly what these Low German Mennonite individuals and families, they just need us to believe, and for us to create a space where they can really just start to shine and to be seen and to be heard. And that's the grounding rule for healing to happen. And honestly, I am like, this may have seemed professional, not because I said damn in there, but whatever. Anyways, I am like the most approachable person you will ever meet. So there is no question, you can ask me about anything. One of my coping mechanisms is I've kind of turned death into this humorous thing I've had to just be able to live through it, so that you can absolutely ask me any question. No question is too crazy, and I'm never offended, to be honest.
with that being said, do we have questions?
Yes, I always have questions.
I'm
I
just
was
gonna
wondering,
come-
sorry, you mentioned that at first there were a lot of rules, and you felt like you were always within all these silly rules, and so as service providers, we don't understand what your rules, what are inside the culture. Could you explain maybe one that you wish people understood? Or
Yeah. Rules. Wow, there's so many. I'm not sure where to start. But two that I mentioned in there that I struggled with was one was dress code, and then the other one was just as women that we were treated differently. Very evidently, right? So those were the things that I questioned. For example, I was, from when I was like 12 till I moved out, one of the rules was I had to wear a certain dress, which is absolutely fine. But I would stuff my clothes underneath my legs, and then I would leave the house and I would change while driving. So to all you officers that are in here, if you ever see somebody changing while they're driving, that's why, because there's rules. I couldn't pull over to the side of the road because then sometimes people would stop and ask what I was doing, which was also not okay. So there's rules like that are pretty general, but just day-to-day stuff, just like not questioning authority, Abe talked about it. You can never talk about yourself in a positive way because then you're bragging. You are not to be considered someone. As soon as you are considered of importance, that is a negative. So that kind of stuff, all in the name of humility and considering others better than yourself.
I know when I was 16, my dad was frustrated that we weren't wearing the dresses enough. And you may notice that sometimes you can always tell the woman is LGM, but for the man, you often can't because he's just wearing jeans and a button-up shirt. So I told him, Dad, if you wear the overalls, then I'll wear the dress. And he had bought us a lot of fabric to make the dresses ourselves, which me and sewing machines don't get along anyway. But so I said that if he wore the overalls, I would, and he never did, so I never wore another dress. I was a little rebellious on it. Any other questions?
I want to thank you so much for sharing. I mean, it's obviously you had a difficult journey, and thank you for your vulnerability today. That's much appreciated.
You're welcome.
In the few months ago, I was asked to, me and a few others were asked to make a presentation to the Human Rights Commission in Winnipeg. They're setting up a display, or they're working on a display on Low German Mennonites and their experience with not only war, but also with the private or the public school system. And so we were able to share the story of what happened to Old Colony Mennonites in Saskatchewan when the provincial government decided to establish English schools in their settlement, when they shut the schools down, when they expropriated the land, and when they named the schools after military battle sites in order to upset them, how they literally starved them out. Like they literally fined them and jailed them, and all of that experience. And then we realized that there's a whole set of trauma here that has never been identified, like has never been named. And all of us are recipients of that intergenerational trauma. And in our office, at the MCC office in Saskatoon, we've been much more intentional now about talking about intergenerational trauma that our people have experienced and trying to name that, identify it, to name it. And I'm just curious, like, for your own experience, like, have you had the opportunity to learn more about your parents' story and why they responded the way they did, and, you know, just to learn about who they are and what shaped them?
That question, I know it's a general question, but it gets me because I can tell you that not a day goes by where now, as I am unfolding in this journey, where I don't wish that they were here and I could have these conversations with them, right? Looking back, my parents never talked about their life, what it was like growing up. I know one or two stories. My mom has had once or twice talked about what the experience was like for my dad to have his milk truck to be taken away, and them being in a place in their lives where they absolutely had no way to provide for us, right? And then also my grandma passed away when my mom was young, and then there was a stepmom, and life was really, really hard. And I remember once or twice my mom talking about how she would walk to school, but that she was so sad that she didn't want to go into the schoolroom because then she just couldn't stop crying. But then the teacher would ask, and then they would go back to her stepmom. And so what she would do is she would leave the house in the morning and go along the camp and choose a fence that was not see-through, and she would sit there the entire day just crying because she just felt there was no place for her to leave her tears. But those are stories that came out once or twice. And then again, they passed away when I was in my early 20s. 10 years ago, March 1st was the 10-year anniversary of their car accident. So there are absolutely stories that we haven't heard, and that I always wish that they were around now for me to be able to ask that. But that's just their growing up. If you look back on Abe's history, the grandparents and the great-grandparents, these stories and the generational trauma, I think, it's absolutely immense, and something that is so hidden and just never brought up. But I see that shifting, and I think it's time. And that's why I said in there that I see this as not only healing my own pain, but generations of pain and trauma. Because I know one thing, that I'm not passing this on to my daughter, right? Yeah.
Any other questions? Okay, well, I think there was a question in the question box, right? Is that relevant for now? You might have sent it to me, but we'll just grab the original. You might know the answer to this one. It says, can you discuss the history, development of general LGM fashions, head coverings for women, dresses? Is there a cultural, religious requirement to continue this? How have some adopted more modern trends, and why do some remain traditional?
I can just share with you from my perspective, and if I were to pass on to you what was passed on to me, it would just be, that's how it's always been, and that's how we do it. So there's your answer. I'm kidding. There is a little bit more to it, but that's literally all we would get if we would ask that question. But so tradition, as Abe mentioned, it is very big, and so some practices are biblically based, and so for women to not cut their hair, for women to not adorn with jewelry and all of that is from certain Bible verses. Depending on which cultural or which church the family is from will depend on what they're wearing, the covering and all of that. But yeah, for the most part, it is linked to the religion or the belief of the church and the cultural practices that church requires, and then also just tradition. So, but yes, so for some churches, after you are baptized, you are required to wear a covering, and for others, once you are married, you are required to wear a covering. So that will be very individual, depending on which church you are actually from, which denomination essentially it would be, depending on Old Colony, Kleingemeinde, and all of that. I grew up Old Colony Mennonite, by the way.
Any other questions? Okay, awesome. So we were going to have FOSPA this afternoon, but because of the weather, we have switched that to tomorrow because we'd like more of you to be able to enjoy that and give you the option of taking off a little bit earlier today. But first, let's give Eva a hand. Thank you so much.